Rappin' with ReefBum is sponsored by Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine.
I'm sure the crowd's going, we won, Mike. We won.
I don't know. I think I'm going to just let these two guys talk. I'm not going to talk tonight because they're good buddies. They're reef keeping legends, and I should just sit back and listen to them because I'll take in a lot more information in terms of me trying to interview them. But hey, welcome back, folks, to another episode of Rappin' with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer, and tonight I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming two icons in the hobby, both Dr. Sanjay Joshi as well as Mike Paletta. Welcome both of these guys back to the show, but I have them on together, which is a very big treat for me. What's up, guys?
Hey, Keith, how are you? And to the rest of the world watching. Hello,
folks.
everyone.
If you have any problems hearing everybody, please let me know in the chat. I think we're good, but given that this is, I have two guests on tonight, it's a little bit of a curveball. Don't do this too often, so if we have any audio issues, let me know. So, all right, there's not a lot of folks out there that don't know you two guys, but let me just briefly explain to the folks out there who we're talking to tonight. Sanjay has written many articles about reef keeping. He has been a speaker at several National Marine Aquarium Society meetings and local clubs. In real life, Sanjay is a professor of industrial and manufacturing engineering at Penn State University. Mike, too, has written a lot of articles for many publications. He has also published two books, The New Marine Aquarium and Ultimate Marine Aquariums. And Mike has also been a speaker at many reef keeping conferences in the U.S. and around the world. And Mike was just named the 2022 MASNA Award recipient. That's a very big deal. Congrats, Mike.
Hey,
that's
my
how,
pleasure, Mike.
That's how it works, huh? This is going to be an excellent show. All right, so before we start digging in with both Sanjay and Mike, I want to thank the sponsors for the show, both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine. I really appreciate these companies supporting the live stream, and I appreciate you folks tuning in and watching. Please spread the word. Hit that like button. I see we've got a bunch of people watching, not as many likes, so let's get those likes up. And as per usual, comments and questions in the chat are very much encouraged. I will do my best to monitor that stuff in the chat. So anyway, guys, the summer is kind of fast approaching to an end here. How has it been going for both of you?
It's been a pretty busy summer for me. Not work-wise, but I've been traveling all over the world, been traveling all over the country, and enjoying the most of this time that I usually get in the summer. So it's been great. Went on a cruise from Venice to Athens, Greece. That was awesome. Spent 2 weeks with my granddaughter. That was awesome.
So I had heard at one point, Sanjay, that you spent 6 weeks away from your tank, right?
This summer, yes. I've spent actually more than 6 weeks away.
Now, how do you manage that in terms of having somebody babysit the tank? You know, what I'm assuming you've got.
Most of this stuff is automated, right? So I've been using an Apex. I use good equipment that can be automated and reliable enough, and I can easily leave my tank for extended periods of time. But I still have one of my neighbors just come in every few days to make sure that nothing has really gone haywire. Right? I mean, I have a little camera. I can view my tank from wherever I am and at least get a good sense of that things are okay. So over the years, I've fine-tuned that system, keep finding the weakest link in there and keep strengthening the weakest link. And so far, keep my fingers crossed, has been working pretty well.
Yeah, I was away recently for a few days on vacation in Maine, and it was some very hot and humid days here in Vermont. And just typically when it's hot and humid here, I have these water sensors, leak sensors that let me know
Yeah,
they trip. Man, it just freaked me out because they tripped, and even though I have somebody coming in to look at the tank and feed the fish and all that stuff, it's like, all right. It was actually on the last day of my vacation, so they weren't coming in that I was going to be home. And I was like, all right, you know what? I'm going to have to trust my instinct on this, that there's not a whole bunch of water on the floor of in the fish tank room. But I also have a live webcam. I got a Nest Cam in the sump room. So
yeah, I use the Nest Cam too. I should put one. I should put one in the back room too.
I'm going to get at least 2 more Nest Cams because I have a live webcam on one tank on YouTube. My other tank, I have nothing on it, the display tank. And then in my sump room, I've got like 3 frag tanks. And I think I want to get at least a couple of more Nest Cams because I don't even keep them on. I have them like hooked into my controller. So when I need to look at them, I turn them on. Because
okay.
It seems like the Nest Cams. It seems like the Nest Cams run a little hot. Maybe I have like some of the one of the older ones, but
mine's been running for 5 years now. I haven't had any issues.
That's good to know.
Yeah. The only thing you can't do with this Nest Cam, you can't zoom in.
Right.
So you can't do that. I mean, if I had to buy another camera, I might get one with a pan-tilt zoom functionality.
I do like.
Let's see closer. And
I do like the fact.
Is that the one we got from Ecotech?
Oh, I'll have to check that out. Oh, we're saying that Mike.
Yeah, it sticks to the front glass. On the soft coral tank, it's fine. I mean, I don't want it on the big tank, but when I'm away, I want to make sure the sunroom tank's okay.
Let me see now. We're apparently we're having some audio issues. Can folks Mike's mute? All right, Mike's.
Hello.
Can people hear Mike now? Can't hear Mike.
Let's see.
Let me look at this here. Let's see.
How's that? Any better?
All good now.
Okay.
Can you hear Sanjay? Can everybody hear Sanjay? Mike is good. Sanjay is good now. Everybody's good. All right. Solve that problem. Can hear everyone now. All right, Mike. So you were muted there, but I didn't really ask you much in terms of what's been going on with you. So now that we could hear you, what's happening with you this summer?
Pretty much the same thing. Been traveling, being retired. I have more free time, but had some family things I had to take care of that took up a lot more time than I wanted. But everything's good. I mean, the tank is finally stabilized. As we told you, Sanjay and I have both been battling tissue necrosis issues for probably most of the year. And after looking at everything and sending in multiple biome tests and everything else to check on the bacteria, I finally found out that it was a high dose of Vibrio and Arcobacter in the tank. And so I went to, when I was having issues with individual colonies starting to show tissue necrosis, I treated them with the high dose Cipro, and amazingly it stopped it on all of them. So then over the past 2 weeks, I did a Cipro treatment that I found out from Randy and Devin at ARC. I did what they had done, where I dosed one 500 milligram tablet per 100 gallons. And I did that every other day for the past previous 2 weeks. It's now been a week since I did. And since then it has finally stopped. So I'm waiting another week, and then I'm going to send in another biological sample to see if I have indeed wiped out the Vibrio. Because since I stopped using the Cipro, I've also been adding a bunch of different bacteria to try and boost the good bacteria back up. I mean, the interesting thing though, with everything good, always something bad happens. For whatever reason, after the 2 weeks of dosing Cipro, my redox went from around 365 down to 215. And I have no idea why or what it killed off, but it's now come back up to 325 after a week. But I also had something that I hadn't had in years, where I had a dinoflagellate outbreak. And my nitrates and phosphates are both relatively high. So now I've been managing that for the past couple of days. I just did a 3-night 3-day blackout on the tank, and I'm treating with Dino-X. And today's the first day the lights are back on, and there's no visible dinoflagellate. So hopefully that worked. But anything you do, as we talked about, you always cause something else to happen. I mean, it's always something, as we say.
Did you try using UV, Mike, on those dinos, or do you know exactly what you have?
I did use the UV. These were not the ones that go out at night. These ones pretty much stayed home on the substrate, because I have a 120 watt UV sterilizer on the tank, and I just changed the bulbs, and it had no effect on them whatsoever. So I had to go to blackout in Dino-X, and right now it seems to be working, but we'll see in a couple days.
Yeah, you know, a number of years ago, I didn't.
Show them under a microscope and take.
Yeah, that's what I.
Because it'd be nice to see what is it that's different in these dinos that they're not being affected by the UV.
Yeah.
Because in my past experience, it's always been the UV has always worked.
Yeah, this is the first time it didn't
so
work
it
for
might
me,
be
which I was very
species.
disappointed in. But I know there's a couple strains that aren't free swimming, so I have no idea. I'm assuming these are. I just got a microscope actually for my birthday, so I have to hook it up and figure out how to use it, which, you know, I love reading directions and stuff like that.
Now, do you find it interesting, Mike, that you've got this outbreak on a mature reef tank? I mean, you did say that, you know, you did one thing and it just kind of like led to another thing, but did that surprise you that it happened to a mature reef tank in terms of getting dinos?
At this point, nothing surprises me, because even if I add nothing to the tank, there's always something in the tank that pops up and causes issues when everything isn't just right. I mean, I've come to the conclusion that keeping a 500-gallon tank connected to 2 other tanks is like keeping plates on a stick. There's always one about to fall off, and you always got to be balancing one thing versus the other.
So I think, Mike, we might have missed this in terms of the audio, but Flavio Amorim, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is asking, is it possible to repeat about the tissue necrosis treatment?
Oh, sure. After battling it for much of the past year and a half, probably off and on, Sanjay said the same thing. It's not widespread rapid tissue necrosis like it used to be, where you had a high temperature and you wiped out a lot of colonies. Everything would be fine for a week or two, and then all of a sudden you'd see it creeping up the base of one coral, and everything would be fine for another week, and you'd see it creeping up another coral. Sanjay's seen the same thing, where sometimes the corals would survive, sometimes they'd die. So I finally got tired of battling this. So I had 3 corals come down with it at the same time, and I treated them with a very high dose Cipro, half of a 500 milligram tablet in 2 gallons of tank water for 4 hours. And I took them out of it, and I put them back in the tank, and miraculously, for the first time, the tissue necrosis stopped. I mean, there was no more, even though it was half on the branches, and by the next day, the polyps had come out on those. Now, this is just my experience, and this is anecdotal, so I don't want everyone going home and doing this, but if you're having these kind of issues, it might be something to look at. So then, miraculously, I was up at ARC and was talking to Randy and Devin about it, and they told me what their treatment is whenever they start to see this kind of stuff, and they came to the recommendation of 1 500 milligram capsule of Cipro per 100 gallons of tank water. So my whole system is 600 gallons, so I was treating with 6 tabs of Cipro every other day, and they recommended for 10 days. I went a little longer, went for 14 days, because I wanted to make sure it was truly done. And once it was over, I've not had any issues with tissue necrosis. And on 3 of the corals where I was starting to get bleaching, the bleaching stopped. And part of the reason that I went with Cipro also was I had sent in a biological analysis to Aquabiome, I think is the company.
Aquabiomics.
Aquabiomics, and it came back with a Arcobacter and Vibrio were both very high, and fortunately both of those are very susceptible to Cipro, because I had tried a couple other antibiotics in the past. I tried Chemiclean, which is erythromycin, and I tried doxycycline, and neither of those really touched it, but the Cipro seems to have worked so far.
Rob Upstate New York, thank you so much, man, for that super chat. Hi, Keith, Mike, and Sanjay. Looked forward to this chat all week. So have I. So Mike, I think the last time you were on, we talked about a theory that you had in terms of your RTN and STN and UV light within the lack of UV light in LEDs. So you had Tulio from Reef Bright over at your house with his photo spectrometer, and he found that there was very little UV being emitted by the LEDs over your tank. So your basic theory was that the lack of UV light in the tanks lit by LEDs is potentially contributing to more pathogens that can cause RTN and STN. So you were skeptical about the the whole UV thing and LEDs?
Yeah,
what is it? Have you moved on from that?
I'm more skeptical. I ran the halides, and I still got the tissue necrosis. I mean, in looking at how much UV you're getting out of the halides, you're getting more, but it hasn't been shown to be bactericidal. So as a result, it doesn't really have much of an effect if tissue necrosis is a result of bacterial infections, which in my experience is primarily what it is, because you probably stress the corals by one thing or another, and then once you stress them, that seems to be when the bacteria take hold. The other thing that I have been playing with, though, is keeping the pH higher, and that also seems to help, because there was actually a paper that came out probably 6 or 7 months ago that showed that high CO2 levels and low pH lead to a microbiome around the corals that tends to exacerbate tissue necrosis and Vibrio and some other pathogenic bacteria. So I've been playing with that as well by having Kalkwasser drip into the tank at night as well. I started that right after I did the Cipro. So that seems to be helping as well, because now my pH doesn't drop below 8.0, 8.05 at night, and now it goes up to 8.3, 8.4 during the day. So I ran the halides for about 6 months, and I never saw any benefit or reduction in tissue necrosis. But now running the Cipro and now dripping in the Kalkwasser at night seems to be making a difference.
So you pulled the halides?
The halides are still on just because I run them for 3 hours and I get a 600 to 700 par, and I'm getting faster growth. But the question is, do I really want faster growth? Because I have so many corals in the tank, they just start growing into each other. So I'm thinking about slowing them down to just an hour or two now. Plus, the cost of electricity went up 23% on June 1st. So that's another reason why I may reduce their usage.
Sanjay, what about you in terms of the RTN, STN episodes in your tank? What's an update on that? Have you had any?
See, I always take a very different approach, right? I don't jump on treatments from treatment to treatment to treatment, because then you never know what really worked, right? So my strategy always is I kind of want to do things one at a time, right? So the first strategy always is do nothing. Maybe it'll ride itself out of there, right?
That hasn't worked.
That hasn't worked.
Cross that off the list.
Okay. Right. So then you move on to the next one. And I did the same thing as Mike did. I did send off my water to Aquabiomics to see if they found anything interesting. And the prevailing theory was that Acrobacter causes this. And I followed their instructions on using Cipro. I just followed whatever they had recommended, and it didn't stop it. Okay. And then since I've been gone so much this year, I said, you know what, I'm just going to keep letting it ride and see what happens.
Letting it ride in terms of doing nothing.
Doing nothing.
Sanjay's always been a big fan of survival of the fittest, so we will go.
So unfortunately, the problem is still ongoing. So now that I'm back, see, I hate working on the tank when I'm going to be home for a week and then I'm gone for another 2 weeks. I hate messing with too many things. So now that I'm back, I might start looking into some of these treatments and see if there is any, I guess, reasonable merit to them to make them work. So we'll see. It's not like RTNs, I just did the corals out right away. But the weirdest thing is that once a coral seems to get it, it will keep getting it. It stops once in a while, and then the coral is doing fine, it keeps growing, and then bam, again, it'll get it. And the way it'll just hit it in the middle of the coral sometimes. so there's definitely something systematic going on. Okay.
Well, what's interesting in my tanks is that it occurs more in the big tank than it does in the frag tank or in the LPS tank. In the LPS tank, I've had no issues with the euphyllias or the gonioporas or any of the other LPS. And in the frag tank, I've had minimal RTN, but it seems to occur in the big tank. So I don't think it's a free swimming bacteria per se, to the degree that it might be, because it's located and all those tanks are interconnected. So it doesn't make any sense to me why it's in the big tank and not in the other two, because it's the exact same water.
Yeah,
that's what drives you nuts. Is there's no rhyme or reason to say, okay, this should be in all of them or it should be in none of them, but it's in one of three.
It can drive you batty all of a sudden. It just kind of seems very random and out of the blue. You know, a lot of times you're on.
Yeah, especially given the fact that, you know, for what, 30 years now, I've been keeping corals, right? Mm-hmm. And yeah, problems come and go. This one seems to hang on.
Yeah, this one has been throughout the year. I mean, it's been at least since Christmas I've been battling this.
Sanjay, do you think old tank syndrome potentially could be something that is causing this? I mean, your tank has been up for a very long time. I know you've had some resets along the way, but
no, there's no major resets.
No major resets.
The only reset was pulling out the acros and treating them for flatworms and putting them back in. So it's still running on the same rock. It's still running on the same sand.
Do you think that could potentially?
Right? So again, the way I think is slightly different from what most people might think. I go, okay, what's old tank syndrome?
Yeah, I don't.
You know, we kind of just call it old tank syndrome. What is it? Right? Is my water gone bad? You know, with some trace elements disappearing, whatever. So now we have ways of at least trying to address that question, right? You can run ICP tests and so on, see if the trace elements are. Again, it's a matter of trusting the ICPs, which I'm not 100% sure how much you trust them, but at least it gives you some sense, right? That maybe so that's one aspect of what I would call an old tank syndrome, right? Maybe your nitrates, phosphate levels are creeping up high because it's an older tank, but those are manageable, right? You can manage nitrates.
You've had incredibly high nitrate and phosphate levels, and your corals were literally growing out of the tank, so that's probably not it.
No, actually, I find when I lower my nitrates and phosphate, the corals don't do as well. Yeah. So what exactly is old tank syndrome? So the third part of that equation might be the bacteria, right?
Yeah.
So potentially now with some of these techniques, there is an opportunity to look at these bacteria and see if there is any merit to this idea that maybe over long periods of time, there's a shift in the bacterial composition and so on. But then I don't know what it was when we first started my tank. So there is no baseline to base it on because these techniques didn't exist. But maybe now we have a way of establishing a baseline and then tracking it over time to see, hey, you know, what's happening.
Sanjay, do you dose bacteria? I can't recall if you dose bacteria.
I don't usually dose bacteria at all.
I do. I dose on a regular basis.
I'm not convinced that the people selling me bacteria have any clue on what bacteria is good bacteria, okay, or bad bacteria, and, you know, any of those things. So I don't really dose it. And now, again, if somebody wants to spend the money, we could do some really cool experiments.
Yeah.
Right? I could take my tank. I could dose these bacteria that they're telling me to dose in there. Right? We could send off a sample of the bacteria to get tested and see what exactly is in there, right? And put it in the tank and see if it made any difference in the tank or not.
Yeah, but no one's going to pay us to do that because that would hurt their business.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive to do those tests. $90 a pop to do the test is not cheap. But what my point is that there are now systematic ways in which a lot of these questions can be answered, right? And surely, you know, there's a lot of people who sell this products won't be excited about doing those things, right? But if there is any independent interest, these things can be done.
Bill's Saltwater Haven is asking Mike and Sanjay, how is your potassium? Low potassium can cause RTN. You guys?
My potassium's around 450, I believe.
Yeah, mine runs about 375 to 400 on the ICP test.
I had issues when it got over 470. Then I was starting to get, I know that was stressing the corals as well. I was high, running it between 430 and 450 now, and that doesn't seem to be the issue with it. I actually just ran 3 ICP tests from 3 different manufacturers at the same time. And it was interesting. On the big major elements, they were all pretty close, but none of them showed I had any trace elements in the tank whatsoever. And I've been dosing trace elements now for the past 6 months on a regular basis. All of them were 0. So that
got to dose more.
Skeptical of them. I was dosing from what the
recommended
scale says, pretty much the maximum. The only thing it said I was high on was iodine.
So getting back to the aquabiomics and the bacteria testing. So I had Dr. Eli Meyer, who runs aquabiomics on the live stream last week, and I had him on before about a year ago. And unfortunately, our conversation got cut off near the end last week because Eli's laptop died on him. But I'm going to have him back on in November. I'm actually doing a little experiment myself, which is interesting. I did a whole big reboot of my 187-gallon tank, and I yanked the Haitian live rock I had in that tank, and I swapped in the Carib Sea Life dry rock, which I had been cooking in a Rubbermaid tub for 6 months, and I had been dosing bacteria daily, the Microbacter, Brightwell's Microbacter 7 bacteria daily, to try to get the rock to be alive, when I put it into the tank. And then what I did was when I pulled the Haitian live rock out, I put it in a brand new cryptic sump. So my goal was to maintain the bacteria population in the system with this big swap out of the live rock and display for the dry rock. And so I'm doing 3 different points in time in terms of the bacteria testing. I'm doing a pre-test, which is before I did the major swap out. I tested the Rubbermaid tub after 6 months with the dry rock in it. And then I also did a post-test 2 weeks after I did the big swap out, and it seems like I'm still waiting for the post test results. But it seems like the rock cooking for 6 months and dosing the bacteria certainly helped bring life to the dry rock, because there were certainly a variety of bacteria present. But I do agree, Sanjay. I think it would be interesting to kind of see in a mature system in terms of a kind of a before and after, in terms of dosing bacteria and observing the coral health. Did the bacteria dosing help? Because
sorry, well, I was going to say, Sanjay and I both had a similar experience a few years ago where we both started tanks at about the same time with dry rock, and we didn't aggressively dose them with bacteria, and we both had issues with the corals, the SPS corals never thriving in the tanks. They would just sit there for a while, be stable, and then they would just fade out. And we talked to some other people, and they all said the same thing. In order to get dead rock to work or dry rock to work, you have to either add a lot of bacteria, or you have to add some live rock to inoculate it and get it going. Because otherwise, without the microfauna and without the bacterial cultures, the corals never seem to really take off. And I've talked to a number of people now, and they've all had similar experiences.
Yeah, I had a pretty bad experience myself too, but I didn't dose any bacteria when I started.
We didn't either. Yeah. That was the problem.
Yeah, so that's why I wanted to.
We didn't know.
That's why I wanted to make it hopefully different with this going on. So far, so good. I'm getting some cyano in the display tank, but everything in terms of the frag tanks that are plumbed into that display tank are looking great. So Mike, you mentioned trace elements, and here's a question for both of you guys. On a scale of 1 to 10. I'd be interested to know what you think about this. How important is it to add trace elements to a reef tank on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not so important, with 10 being very important?
I think adding trace elements is probably a 7 or 8 if you have everything else really good. If everything else isn't really good and balanced, it's going to be a 1. It's not going to matter. You have to have, they're sort of like the key factor, the cherry on top of the sundae. Once you have the sundae built with the ice cream and the whipped cream, if you don't have that sundae built, that cherry isn't going to matter. in my experience. I mean, you could add all the trace elements you want, but if your nutrient levels aren't good, your light isn't good, your flow isn't good, and your calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium aren't good, it's not going to make any difference. But when you have everything good, they can make a difference. They can bring out more colors. They can add more health. Like certain trace elements, even more so. Like manganese, I have found is vital for growing gonioporas. I run experiments all the time, as you know, because I'm always tinkering. And so I have these gonioporas in my LPS tank that were just literally growing out of the tank. And I wanted to see, okay, is it from feeding or is it from manganese or it's just the tank in general? So I kept feeding them and I stopped the manganese and they did well, but they didn't grow quite to the same level. Then I stopped feeding and just added the manganese and it was basically the same thing. But when I added the manganese and was feeding, that's when they really took off. So it's like I said, it's when you have everything really good, they can add to it. But if everything isn't perfect, I don't think they're going to add significantly to a major benefit to the tank.
Sanjay?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me the question slightly differently, I can give you a better answer.
How would you like me to ask you the question?
He doesn't add trace elements.
Well, I never.
Well, then you should say one.
But do I? Well, no, but do I believe that trace elements get depleted in systems? My answer would be yes. Okay, especially if you're not doing water changes, they'll definitely, they'll definitely get depleted to some extent, right? What I don't know is what levels is it start to become an issue with the corals, right? So it's a safe bet to say, okay, I'll just make it what natural seawater is, or get close enough to it, and that should be okay, right? So yeah, I can definitely see that certain tanks could get depleted. I've tried lots of different trace elements over the years, and when my tank was doing really good, it made no difference to my tank. Okay. So obviously, there are times when some element might get out of whack. They get consumed. I can dump a lot of iron in my tank and it never shows up on the ICP. Right? So it's either getting used or it's getting oxidized or whatever, and it's becoming useless and not doing anything. Similar things happen with manganese. It tends to disappear rapidly. But if you're doing water changes, there's a good likelihood that you're adding them all in. A lot of people like this whole idea, I'm going to use an ICP, I'm going to measure it, and then whatever is missing, I'll replenish that. Is that a good method to think about? Kind of, as long as you trust your ICP.
Yeah, well, that's why I said I ran 3 simultaneous ICPs. None of them showed any trace elements despite 6 months of dosing. So my faith in them is.
Is there a difference between 0.004 parts per billion and 0.008 parts per billion?
No.
I don't know the answers to those questions, right? So it's very hard to give a definitive answer. But I do know people whose tanks have improved and started adding trace elements because there's likelihood that their tanks didn't have certain elements in there, right? But we don't know which ones make a difference, right? We know manganese and iron probably do.
We know zinc and barium probably have some effect.
Is nickel going to make a difference? I don't know.
Is rubidium going to make a difference?
Rubidium going to make a difference?
I mean, until someone runs individual corals and adds trace elements to one tank and not to the other, and you can see a difference. I mean, but what you would have to do is run a dozen different corals and say, okay, this one made this one redder compared to this other tank. Nobody's going to run those on each individual trace element. It's just too prohibitive to do that because there's so many trace elements. And also, some of them interact with each other. So is this one only beneficial if you're also adding that one, or do these two compete? So it's always going to be a kind of gray area, and you're putting your faith on, okay, I saw this benefit. It gets back to where it's much more anecdotal than it is scientific.
I mean, a lot of people run algae filters, right? So you're growing chaeto, you're growing algae on the screen, whatever, right? We know the plants to grow well need a whole bunch of different trace elements. And a lot of people find after running these algae filters for a while that their algae doesn't grow as well. Right? It's probably depleted some trace element that now has become limiting to growth. Right? So at that point, yeah, people are now, you have to add some of these trace elements to get the algae to grow.
Right. And is that
right? So my argument is, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to grow corals? Or are you trying to grow
or is
algae?
that missing trace element that the algae?
If you're going to grow algae, I guarantee you're going to need those trace elements.
Yeah, I have bad luck keeping Cato alive.
Yeah, partly, I'm sure it's got to do with trace elements.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
So yeah, I think in some ways your algae might be competing with your corals. Right? They're all using the same things.
Right. And so that's kind of like the rub, right? In terms of using macroalgae, I used to use GFO, but I didn't like using GFO, after a while because not only does GFO bind phosphates, but it's going to also bind other valuable trace elements. So that could potentially.
Oh, so it binds arsenic. Is that a good trace element to have?
It takes the good with the bad, I guess. I don't know, the bad with the good.
Yes, there's always going to be some of that, right? It might bind other things. I'm not a chemist, so I really can't say a whole lot about it. But definitely it's going to bind a few things. So yeah, if it's binding things that are starting to affect your coral growth, you might have an issue with it.
Well, one of the other questions I have about ICP testing is I've seen a lot of my friends' ICP tests, and basically all of us show high lithium and high aluminum levels, and none of us can figure out where those are coming from other than those are an artifact of the ICP test.
No, I think they're coming in from the chemicals that we use to mix the salt.
Okay. Well, we're all using different salts.
But chemicals are the same. Underlying chemicals are all pretty much the same. Right? And I'm willing to bet if you trace the supply chain, the sources might be the same.
Yeah, I'm betting on a lot of them. They're the same source for,
So it very well could be. I mean, this Trident showed that a long time ago, that the American tanks were always high in lithium compared to the European tanks.
Does the brand of ICP test, the type of ICP test, the company you're using matter?
Well, there's two of them, right? There's the ICP OES and there's the ICP MS. The ICP MS is a lot more sensitive compared to the ICP OES. And that's a lot of the companies are using ICP OES, but now there's a few that are trying to use the ICP MS, which has a much higher sensitivity. So maybe that'll help with some of the trace elements a little bit better. Maybe they'll be more detectable.
What's frustrating to me is...
But I don't think the answer is there. We've been keeping reefs for 20, 30 years, and we never bothered about this stuff. And
that's the whole thing.
So explain that to me.
That's the whole thing.
This is what I said. Explain that to me. Why did we have so much success in the past, right, without knowing some of these things? But now we can't seem to have any good success. A lot of people.
Here's an example in terms of having too much information these days and making bad decisions based on that information. So years ago when I had some big thriving reef tanks with a lot of SPS growing out of the water practically, I never measured for phosphate. I never measured for magnesium. I measured alkalinity. I looked at the nitrate, the salinity, the temperature. So now I measure phosphate every week with a Milwaukee test kit. And it's frustrating, right? Because phosphate is a very, very tough element to measure with a hobby grade test kit. So I was looking at the information in terms of what I was getting back for phosphate test kit results, and I was getting, week after week after week, it was 0, 0, 0, 0. I was like, all right, I guess I better start dosing some phosphate. And I ended up dosing a little bit too much phosphate, and I had a couple of corals overnight, I believe due to the high phosphates that I was dosing, brown out on me. So I think that's an example of just having all this information at your fingertips. And I'm sort of like you, Sanjay. I think I try not to overreact based on the information that I see out there that I have available to myself. I really like to kind of sit back and look for big, broad trends. But I think that's kind of an example of, you know, acting on a piece of information that we have, you know, more at our fingertips today than we've had in the past. And it's the same thing with ICP tests.
But I actually
Especially
think,
since we don't know the correlations.
I was going to say, actually,
Right.
I think it's more than just having a high phosphate level. Sanjay was running phosphate levels off the chart, and his corals were the most colorful corals you've ever seen. So it's not just a,
And there's no algae in the
no,
tank. either.
you couldn't find a speck of algae in the tank. His nitrates were at
Right.
90, and I think his phosphates were at like 0.2 or 0.3, and his corals were literally growing out of the tank. And when he would flick on all the blue lights, it would literally be blindingly colorful. I mean, they were the most spectacular corals you've ever seen. So it wasn't just a function of having high phosphate. There's way too much than just one factor. It's not just I had high phosphate. There's more to it that they brought out because of X, Y, and Z, not just X. But that's the problem. We now have so much information. We don't know if it's X, Y, or Z because we now have A, B, C, D, and E to go with those. So we now have 7 things to look at, not just one.
Yeah, I mean, I was just making an example in terms of like taking the information and acting on it. Where you know, I think phosphate test kits are pretty fairly inaccurate these days, and I, you know, I think
Well, the inaccuracy all depends on what you
Right.
want from it, right? If it's 0.2 and it's really
Not a big deal.
0.25, is that such a big deal? If it's 0.2 and it's showing you 0.8, then yeah, that's a big deal, right? So I don't think that inaccurate where a 0.2 reading is going to show up as a 0.8 reading, right? It could be 0.3, it could be 0.1 in that range. You know, so if you think about these things in terms of ranges, right? Every measurement device is going to have some uncertainty in the measurement.
Well, I use
Right.
them more,
And the less uncertainty you want, the more you're going to pay for that test.
right. I use them more as a trend rather than
Yeah.
a specific number. Because as we've all learned the hard way, if you're chasing a number, you're basically going to drive yourself nuts and you're probably going to be killing more corals than you're going to save. So you don't necessarily want to chase a number. You want to look at a trend and figure out what's going on. Okay, my phosphate's 0.2, now it's 0.3, now it's 0.4. What's going on? Obviously something's
Right.
not good. And is that trend then going to produce a deleterious effect in the tank? And you don't want to stop it and go from 0.2 to 0 either, because that's going to cause just as much problem.
I like Bert Minshew, Confucius say, the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know.
That's pretty much the hallmark of this hobby.
All right, so somebody asked this question, and it was,
That's why you'll never find a PhD researcher who's deep into the material will never tell you that they know everything. They'll never give you a definitive answer.
well, they're very
that's
smart.
always a possibility.
They're smart enough to know there is no definitive answer.
So Rob Upstate New York is asking this question, Mike, what salt are you using? And then I got a follow-up question there for you, Mike.
I'm still using Instant Ocean. I've been using it for 40 years. And main reason is because it's been consistent. I've not had things fluctuate. I mean, I tested before I added just to make sure, but it always is pretty much within, 5% of where it's always been.
Sanjay?
I've been using Instant Ocean.
All right, then I kind of know what the answer to this
Forever.
next question is. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is the brand of salt you use?
I think it's a 10, but I think the biggest factor is it stays consistent. Because I remember
Right.
in the past having people call me that were switching around with salts, and they would call and say, all my snails died, but they wouldn't tell me what was going on. And I'd sit on the phone with them for an hour trying to figure out what's going on. And finally I'd say, what salt did you use? And I'd say, oh, brand X. And I'd go, did you look at the sodium levels on it? Because this salt was known for being very inconsistent in its sodium levels. And if they bounced them off the walls, all the snails would die. So after 3 or 4 times with this, people would call me and say, you switched to this salt, didn't you? And I go, yeah. And I'm going, there's what happened. So it's a 10, but in terms of being consistent. You don't want to be bumping around. Okay, I got this salt for $40 a bucket, but I got this one for 20, so I'm going to change to it. Now I got this one for 80 because it's a higher brand of salt. You keep moving things around, you're going to have more problems than it's worth. Do you agree, Sanjay?
I mean, there is a likelihood of you getting a bad batch of salt, right? And it's likely that it could happen with any salt company if their quality control is not good, right? I don't worry too much about, oh, the alkalinity is low when you mix it, because I know I can adjust it, right? I know I can adjust the calcium, so, those kind of things, little things here and there don't
Sanjay,
bother
are you
me too
testing the
much.
newly mixed salt water, or are you just testing your tank and adjusting accordingly?
I just test my tank and adjust accordingly.
I test the mixed up salt just because I've heard too many horror stories from people that I did this and this happened. Even though I trust Instant Ocean, I'm always a Ronald Reagan fan. Trust but verify.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question in terms of.
I mean, at the most, I'm doing 10% water change on a 500-gallon tank. That's 50 gallons, right? Even if things are off, how much are they going to have an impact on a 500-gallon tank, right? If I was going to do a 50-gallon water change on a 55-gallon tank, I'd be a lot more careful and measure the salt before I dumped it in, because that's like 100% water change.
I only do it now after hearing all the horror stories from the one salt that was out there that people wiped out their whole tank. So I've become more paranoid, because it takes, 5 minutes to do a test? So I run the tests just to make sure. I mean, I'm much more adamant at changing my RODI filters and my carbon on my processed water than I am worried about the salt, to be honest with you. Because I've also heard numerous horror stories from your municipal authority suddenly starts adding chemical X into the water, and all of a sudden you don't know it and it wipes out a tank. So I'm paranoid about everything. So I actually have my water authority, if they change anything, I have mandated that they call me, because I've explained to them that if they do not, there will be a major lawsuit for loss of coral life. So they've actually been pretty good about it.
What are you testing, Mike, in terms of the newly mixed salt water? What are you testing for?
I'm testing calcium, I'm testing alkalinity, I'm testing salinity, and I'm testing magnesium. And that's basically all I need to test.
Yeah, but they added copper recently to some of the salt, and what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You can't test for
you
it.
can't test for it.
Here's a quick question. Hey, Mark Vanderwall's in the house. Did Sanjay ever restart the softy tank after the tank failure?
Not really, only because my stand on that tank is on the verge of falling apart. So I don't want to, I need to get a new stand for it. Until I can do that, I'm not putting any corals in there, because
as soon as you
these MDF stands, I don't care what these people say, what they coat them with, these MDF stands don't work well.
Is it on the? Is it in the basement, or is it on a? That's good.
It's in the basement. It's definitely, you can see it crumbling.
Yeah, Sanjay's taking all his tanks out of the upstairs. I mean, I used to walk into his house. There was a tank right in the entryway, a tank in his office. Now everything's downstairs.
Yeah, Sanjay, how old is that 500-gallon tank?
It was set up in 2006.
And we talked about this. You actually had the Aquarium Obsessed come and replace the front glass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are you worried at all in terms of that tank? At some point down the line, busting a seam again, or?
I hope not, because if it busts a seam and I'm not around, that'll be the end of my reef keeping.
You'd start another one.
If it happens while I'm gone.
So is there any thought in the back of your head about doing a complete restart? Any thought about that?
No.
It is a lot of work.
No. Partly because I look at this thing and I go, there's an opportunity here to learn about old tanks, right? There's very few tanks that you see that have been around for 16 years and set up with the same rock and sand and everything else. So there's clearly an opportunity to learn about these things, right? So if I tear it up, that opportunity is gone.
Well, you can keep that. Right? You can keep that experiment going on and start something new.
No.
Well, that's what that's what that 75 is going to, when it goes back up, it'll be my something new. But I need to get a good stand, and none of these, like, the tank's a Red Sea tank. They made these stands, and I'm trying to get a replacement stand for it, but there's no wooden stand that they make for it. You know, it's all the same material. I'm like, I don't want to stand with this material anymore. You know, so it's kind of in limbo right now.
Next,
But I have a 500-gallon soft coral tank at Penn State, so I do have a 500-gallon
There you
soft
go.
coral tank.
next time I come over, Sanjay, I'm going to bring cinder blocks, and we're going to take that tank down and put it on the cinder block, so you'll have a stand that will last, and then you can set up the soft coral tank. No one sees it but me anyhow, so yeah, I mean, you may as well put the cinder blocks under it.
So, all right. This is a question I thought long and hard about asking you guys, and I think it's going to be helpful for folks out there. So both of you guys have had a long, distinguished career as reef keepers, a lot of experience and what have you. But, you know, there's just so much information out there, right? There's social media, there's Instagram, there's flashy things left and right where people are potentially following, I don't know, little trends here and there, and it's a lot different than the older days in terms of, you know, right? In terms of reading books.
Oh yeah.
And articles.
Books.
And
what are books?
you guys have, as I talked about at the beginning, penned a lot of very, very useful and insightful articles and books. But so I think mentors in the hobby is a big thing. People that you can follow, right? In terms of mimicking somebody that's had a lot of success, and you guys have certainly had a lot of success, and for newbies and new reef keepers to be able to kind of, you know, mimic what these folks are doing that have had great success with their tanks. So for each of you, if you could pick 3 people in the industry right now that folks should pay attention to, follow, and it can't be, you know, Mike, you can't say Sanjay, and Sanjay, you can't say Mike.
I was saying Sanjay, because that's who I'd follow.
If you could pick 3, each of you guys, 3 people that folks should really pay attention to, you know, in this hobby, who would they be?
I don't know, because I don't follow anybody per se. I look at people's tanks, I see nice things, and everybody has a different idea. Like I said, when I was up at ARC and I talked to Randy and Devin, I found out about the Cipro treatment. And then when I went and saw Dan at TCK, I learned something. Everywhere I go, I learn something new rather than one person. There is no one perfect formula, and there's no one perfect guru, because if there was, we'd all be doing the exact same thing. It's every tank. You could give Sanjay and I the exact same corals, the exact same equipment. Our tanks would look completely different. So listening to 1 or 3 people is kind of not going to work, because everybody does everything slightly differently. But what I would say, if you find someone that you do trust and you see their tanks and you know they're good, just follow what they're doing. Don't be jumping around doing stuff like I do, which is, I'm telling you from my own experience, don't constantly be jumping around. Follow something that works and then stick with it. Don't follow the latest trend. Don't follow the latest fad. Because like we discussed earlier, it used to be much simpler. We had less information and we were just as, or if not more, successful, because we weren't constantly chasing numbers. We weren't constantly chasing a fad. And life was much simpler than it is now. So that would be my suggestion. I don't follow anyone online per se, but I listen to people that have successful tanks as to what they're doing. Okay, what trace elements you're adding, or what's your lighting schedule, or, you know, what are you doing differently that makes you successful? And I may follow it, or I may, because of my own nature, change it a little bit, which is part of the fun of this hobby, is learning from people, but also tweaking it yourself.
Sanjay, what do you think?
I'm the same way. I mean, at this point, if I have specific questions about things, I know the right people to call and contact, right? And most likely they're friends of mine and they'll actually reply to me, right?
Yeah.
So
we're blessed that way.
I mean, there's a lot of,
that we trust.
There's a lot of people whose knowledge I would consider as being a vetted knowledge, right? And they're not going to give me bullshit, right? So they might even tell me they don't know, which is very, very likely they might not know. But there are sounding boards, and we can exchange ideas and try to figure out whether this idea makes sense or not before we try it, right? Mike likes to jump into things without trying. He thinks that the next best thing to grow corals is out there. I remember the days when he was putting human growth hormone in his aquarium.
What?
Yeah, that was in the
because the
early
Italians were doing
2000s.
it.
There was a compound called popone that the Italians were mixing up, which was a coral food that had human growth hormone in it. So I couldn't get human growth hormone because it's prohibitively expensive, but I could get other growth hormone, which is very similar. And then I switched that over to amino acids, and that led to the amino acid addition to the tanks, which we also found a really good food for nasty bacteria. So I've greatly limited my addition of amino acids at this point since I've been battling tissue necrosis. But I do try more things than Sanjay does. I'm more of an experimenter. Sanjay's like my dad. He's a Luddite in terms of changing things or trying something new. I'm someone that thinks, okay, let's try this. I'm always tinkering, but that's my background is in experimenting. So I always like to experiment a little bit. That's what keeps me excited. Okay, I found this works or this doesn't work.
That's why my corals grow way better than Mike's. They grow much faster.
It's true. I don't
Too much
deny that.
change is bad, right?
I mean, I change things. I'm happy to change things if they make sense to me, right? But I'm not changing things for the sake of changing.
No, and I have gotten better over the past 2 or 3 years where I'm not changing things every month or every 2 months. During COVID was bad. I was bored and I was changing things every month and doing an experiment. Since COVID, I have basically not been changing things and not doing anything really differently. I've gotten much more stable and going back to old school where I'm not constantly trying to find the next best thing. And that has stabilized things other than just battling the stupid bacteria.
A lot of fads have come and gone through this hobby since I've been in the hobby, right? And ultimately, people have gone full 360 on these things, right? And gone back to what a lot of us were saying a long time ago. You can't run a tank with 0 nitrates and 0 phosphates. It's ridiculous,
Yeah. If they don't have any nutrients,
now people are dosing nitrates and dosing phosphates because it's come full circle, right? So a lot of these things, I guess, people jump on these bandwagons because they see that's the way somebody is at least doing it, or at least showcasing that that's what they're doing, right? All these coral farms, they push this whole idea of blue light, fine, but do you really see what they're doing? They're running full spectrum light at least for 3, 4, 5 hours a day.
The blue
makes
them look a lot better.
It makes them look better, but it doesn't mean it makes them grow better.
It doesn't make them grow better. Sanjay used to grow the best corals you've ever seen under Iwasaki 6500K metal halides. He used to grow humilus corals that were basically cinder blocks. We used to have to go with a hammer and chisel to take them out of the tank. That's how thick they grew. Nobody even has humilus corals anymore now because nobody can break a little tiny frag and sell a 1/4 inch of humilus because it's not profitable to sell something like that. And if you see one, it's like, oh my God, what's that? It's a beautiful coral. You don't see them anymore. All you see right now are tenuis and milliporas because they grow fast and they're colorful. But there's a zillion other corals that are just as nice and just as interesting that are much more difficult to see. When you walk around any of the shows, the things that amaze me the most, you don't see a whole lot of blue corals anymore.
No.
And the reason for this is blue light washes out the blue corals. So you don't see blue corals anymore. I love blue corals.
I'm with you on that. All right, I'm just taking a look at the chat here, and I want to incorporate a couple of the questions from the viewers. Blue Reef, Keith, can you ask Mike what his thoughts about Andrew Sandler's tank was? So I know, Mike, you visited that beautiful 17,000-gallon reef tank. Quick thoughts?
Unless you see it in person, the pictures, the videos, everything do not do it justice. I mean, I wrote it up for the upcoming Coral magazine, and it's the longest that has ever taken me to write an article in 40 years. It took 8 rewrites. and it's the longest tank article they've ever done in Coral Magazine. And it is as nice as the 17,000 gallon tank is. There's 6 other tanks around the house that are just as interesting, at least to me, because they have unique corals, unique fish. I mean, you see that tank and it's like being on a reef. And if you look at it from above, which I got to do with a box, and you look down on it, it looks like a reef in Fiji when you're on the boat driving over the reef.
Wow.
And these corals are just roughly 18, 20 months in that tank. This is not a fully established tank yet. As those corals grow and fill in and become the size of a coffee table or a piano, which is what they're going to do, this tank's going to be even more spectacular. Right now, the corals are all this big, you know, a foot, 2 feet. But in 17,000 gallons, a 2-foot coral looks like a frag in our tanks. I mean, it's just amazing. But more amazing are the fish and how the fish interact. And when you watch them throw the food in, he feeds 5 times a day, roughly 3/4 of a pound of food at a clip. And you watch this frenzy of fish going after it. It's just spectacular to see, because these are not just yellow tangs. Oh, there's 40 yellow tangs in there. There's Personatus angels. There's a conspic blue line hybrid. There's a hybrid colored Desjardini tang that no one has ever seen before. There's a pair of crosshatch triggers that are spawning that attack anyone that goes into the tank. There's all these little wrasses. There's just so much. You could sit there for an hour and you just stare at one spot, and every 10 or 15 minutes you'll find something new that you didn't see before. I mean, it literally takes your breath away. I mean, if you see it in person, you basically want to come home and tear your tank down and go, this isn't even work.
It just, yeah, makes you feel a little just overwhelmed in terms of what you're looking at in terms of the size. And I know the equipment that he uses is like just, I can't fathom. He's got several large rooms full of equipment.
He basically has my house full of equipment. No, I mean, it is well done.
What I love about Andrew is that Andrew is just so passionate about everything.
Yeah, Andrew's very passionate about that. I mean, Andrew could hang out with us.
He's very passionate about what he does, and that shows. Right? I mean, I've seen that tank from the day it was being built in his house. I remember the first time I went to his house when he had the peppermint angels in his old house, and I went to see those peppermint angels and stuff, and he drove me over to his new house that was being built at that time, and showed me, where the tank was going in and all that stuff. And so I've been watching it over the years being built, and it's incredible. And it took him longer than he wanted to, but it doesn't matter. It's now it's an incredible tank, and I just love the passion he has.
Yeah, I mean, he still loves it every day. He still enjoys it.
It's not people go, oh, he's got the money, he's a rich guy, but no, it doesn't matter. He still has the same passion that you and I have for the reef.
And he's had this since the 90s. I mean, he was one of the early buyers of retail Acropora before anyone was even keeping Acropora. He was experimenting with it like we were. I mean, I just really hope my write-up does it justice. I mean, it took me a long time to try and capture everything about it, but it literally takes your breath away when you walk in and just see this. If you see the video and you think, oh, it's not even close.
No. It's incredible when you see it.
And then when you see it on 3 sides, because you can only see one side at a time, but when you stand on one of the sides, you look here and you look there, and it's a completely different viewpoint of everything that's going on in the tank. And then when you see everything that goes into running the tank, again, you want to just go home and go, I don't even want to do this hobby anymore, because it's just...
I mean, it's the size of a public aquarium tank, right?
It's bigger than most public aquarium reef tanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
awesome. I'll have to try to pay him a visit one of these days, because it just it just sounds like it's the pinnacle of an aquarium that you can keep in a house. But okay, I saw a question earlier in the chat that is always a question that's in the back of my head, and it's a question that comes up a lot, I think, in the hobby, and this is about cyano. So I wanted to get your guys' thoughts. Michael Nunley asked this question. I have a 180-gallon mixed reef with a little bit of cyano nitrates or 8.0 8.5 and phosphates are 0.12. I treated the tank with ChemiClean and just treated the tank again with ChemiClean about 24 hours ago. I don't see a question in there, but let's talk about that in terms of how to handle cyano with chemicals. And I think there's been a lot of evidence out there that ChemiClean is an antibiotic, right? And it potentially is not only going to kill the bad bacteria but the good bacteria. What do you guys feel about using ChemiClean to treat cyano?
I've used it. I dose bacteria now after I do anything, just because I've become much more aware of trying to keep the microbiome around the corals healthier. But before I do ChemiClean, if I just have a little spot of cyano, I tend to spray it with peroxide with a bulb baster. And 9 times out of 10, that usually takes care of it. And it usually occurs in a dead spot or where detritus is accumulating or something like that. So after I wipe it out with the peroxide, I try to increase the flow there, and I try to make sure no detritus accumulates in that area. And a lot of times that's enough to take care of it. But if it isn't, then I will resort to ChemiClean. But right after I do the 1 or 2 doses of it, then I go back to adding bacteria to try and make up for what it has killed off. And I know of people now that do ChemiClean prophylactically once a month. I'm not a big advocate of that. I'm having worked with antibiotics for a lot of my adult life in what I did for my real job. There aren't any real perfect antibiotics for anything. So whenever you kill off something good, or something bad, you're also going to kill off something good. So you want to make up for that by adding other things to the tank to make up for it. But like Sanjay said, in a lot of these bacteria that we're adding, we don't know if we're adding all good bacteria, good and bad, or we have no idea. That's one of the next things we need to see. What's in your bacterial mix, and how do we know these are all good, and how do we know they're bad bacteria free?
So, Mike, if you had cyano pop up again, how would you handle it?
I thought I just answered. You mean Sanjay?
Well, no. If you said you've used ChemiClean in the past, if you had, knowing what you know now, let's say if you had cyano again pop up in the future, would you still go with the ChemiClean, or would you go with other methods?
No, I'd still go with ChemiClean. That's the one I found that works the best, causes the least amount of grief and aggravation. And like I said, right after I dose it, then I start dosing Microbacter 7, Dr. Tim's, Bactero from Fauna Marin, and there's one other that I dose. I don't think anyone has a perfect strains of bacteria in a bottle, so I add a variety of different bacteria just to make sure I'm covered.
Sanjay, what do you think about cyano and the use of ChemiClean?
I do the same. My approach is, if it's got small patches of cyano, I don't worry about it. Cyano seems to come and go. And I've seen small patches will show up and I don't do anything, and then it disappears. Right? Once in a while, it goes haywire. It'll just be everywhere. When it gets to that point of being everywhere, that's when I would think about putting ChemiClean and killing it.
But even
so, I just wait until it gets really bad, and most of the time it doesn't get bad. The little patches come and go.
Something has to be really out of whack for it to really take off. But when it does get bad, it gets really bad. Then I go to ChemiClean and I go to a blackout. I'll go to 2 or 3 days of blackout, and that seems to get rid of it really fast.
Mike, during the blackouts, have you found that your corals stress out and perhaps you lose a couple of corals, or have you not had that experience? I mean, do they all lighten up a little bit?
They all lighten up a little bit, but they bounce back 2 or 3 days later. They look like I haven't done a blackout. Like I said, you could turn off your lights for 3 or 4 days. You can turn off your skimmer for 3 or 4 days. The only thing you can't turn off for 3 or 4 days is your flow. I mean, I'm a big advocate of having a lot of flow in the tank. I mean, that's when I've lost corals, it was mainly due to inadequate flow more than anything else.
A question from Born to Be Shooter Josh. Would lower than ideal pH be a possible cause for stunted coral growth? I dose and feed constantly and just got a brand new light that is as high as the corals will tolerate, but still have stunted growth. Any thoughts on that?
As bulk reef supply showed, higher pH leads to higher growth rates. So if your pH is dropping down to 7.6, 7.7, even 7.8, and isn't getting much over 8, then your growth will be stunted. If you get your pH where it stays over 8 for most of the day, typically you'll get faster growth. That's one of the reasons why I think Sanjay had such phenomenal growth. He was blasting that tank with so much light that the pH was relatively high. So the corals were growing very well in that instance. Would you agree, Sanjay?
I mean, that's what the whole global climate change is showing people, that excess CO2 is changing the pH levels in the ocean.
You're getting acidification, you're getting slower growth rates.
Right. That acidification is going to slow down your coral growth. In tanks, sometimes we can get away with lower pH because we can jack up the alkalinity to compensate, right? Because so that helps raising alkalinity a little above normal. We have that parameter to play with. I can't add alkalinity in the ocean that easily, but in the tank we can. So sometimes having higher alkalinity helps, even if your pH is tending towards slightly lower. Because adjusting pH is not easy, right? It's a function of carbon dioxide. That's the only way you're going to change the pH. So when you add kalkwasser, essentially, it's reacting with the carbon dioxide in the water, and that's what's increasing your pH.
Yeah, in the summertime when it's really hot, or in the wintertime when it's really cold, a lot of people have pH issues because the pH in the room is really high. I think I talked about this before.
Yeah.
I have a CO2 monitor. If it's just my wife and I and the dogs in the house and the windows are closed, the CO2 down there will be around 600, 620. That's not an issue. We have a party and have 8 people here. The CO2 level downstairs in a closed room will get to be 1,200, 1,400, and I can watch the pH drop way down, and I can see that the corals aren't quite as happy for a couple days after that. So, I mean, I open the windows almost every night to blow out the CO2 in the room and blow fresh air into the room to keep the CO2 levels down.
So you just referred to Mike pH swings. What about alkalinity swings? I had a guest on a few weeks ago, Dong Zhou, who is a scientist. He's been in the reef keeping hobby for a very long time, and he pointed to some scientific literature that basically was showing that alkalinity swings are not really going to be bad in terms of coral growth and health. What are you guys' thoughts about that? Have you experienced in the past bad things happening with your corals when you've had alk swings, or not so much so? I mean, when we're talking about alk swings, I'm not talking about going from like 8 to 12 or something. I'm talking about should we be stressing out about an alk swing of like 8.5 to 10? A point to a point and a half.
No, I've had problems when I've gone from like 8 to like 11, something like that, and then stupidly try to bring it down fast, which is I've learned the hard way. If you get that bump up in alkalinity, just let it gradually come down. Don't try to bring it down real fast. If you slow it down, I don't have issues. When I've tried to bring it down fast after having that bump up for whatever reason, that's when I've had issues.
Yeah, same thing with me. I mean, I don't worry about alkalinity swing of 1 or 2 DKH. It doesn't bother anything. There you go from 10 to 6. Okay, I can see that happening as stressing things.
Are you
out.
using a?
I usually lose about 2 DKH per day if I turn off all my alkalinity addition to the tank. But even then, if I let it go, it doesn't keep dropping to like 2 every day, right? It's slow. It flattens out around 6, somewhere there, But yeah, it definitely, especially when I was running it high, I've run my tank all the way up to 14 DKH in the past. Yeah.
But it was consistent.
And then if you drop from 14 to 10, I mean, that's a big difference.
Yeah, the main thing is consistency rather than just this quick spike.
You drop from 10 to 8, you don't see much of a difference.
Yeah, the same thing for me. I think when I see alkalinity, creeping down, I think that's always a good thing because that tells me that the corals are consuming the alkalinity, and that's like a sign of a healthy tank. I guess when it kind of goes the other way, that always gets a little concerning to me when it starts to creep up a little bit because they're not consuming as much. I would assume if your alkalinity is going up.
Well, it's your addition too, right? I mean, you're adding alkalinity. So maybe there's a fluctuation there that's causing it
if
to
you're
go up
using
and down.
calcium reactor or what have you, and
hey, if you're not that consistent with it.
Both you guys.
Right. So again, it goes back to the fact that you can measure it every hour if you wanted to, and stress about it.
Right. I mean,
I will say though,
the past thing you never bothered with.
No, I will say that the most consistently balanced alkalinity tank I've ever seen is Julian's tank, where he doses like every 5 minutes or something, and his coral growth is phenomenal in his tank. I mean, so he is the epitome of consistency.
Do we need alkalinity monitors to be monitoring our alkalinity 5 times a day?
I do mine.
Not in my
I do mine 4 times a day, and that's fine. Every 6 hours is fine. I mean, as long as you're doing it at the same time, it gives you a good idea. If you're doing it at 1 o'clock and then it's 3 o'clock, no. But at the same time, every day you see, it goes down during the day, it goes up at night, and you're dosing the same consistent way. I mean, I have dosers to keep my alkalinity the same, and the amount they dose at night compared to during the day is like 10% of what they dose during the day.
So you're using 2-part?
Yeah, 3-part.
3-part. Sanjay, your calcium reactor?
I'm using
Are you worried about the CO2 shortage?
No. I mean, because of the calcium reactor, my CO2 actually, my pH runs a little on the low side.
I'm talking about the. So I went out.
The availability of CO2.
There's apparently in the Northeast there's a shortage of carbon dioxide out there. I went out to yesterday to go fill my CO2 canister, 20-pound canister, and I was told that there was a contamination that impacted a whole bunch of states in the area, and that there will be no CO2 available until October. I was like, yikes.
That can be problematic, yeah.
Do you guys have CO2 around you? Maybe I'll come road trip and pick up some CO2.
I always have I have 3 CO2 tanks.
I had an extra one that I used, so I got 2 systems. I got calcium reactors in both systems, so I had an extra CO2 tank, and one tank ran out, so I swapped it out, and I got the other tank going, which seems to have enough CO2 in it for a while. But I always like to, have that spare one filled up. Not this time.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to go and check. I've got 2 empty ones sitting around right now. Maybe I should get them filled.
Yeah, you should get them filled while you can.
You should check, because this seemed to be a very broad-reaching problem. I don't know if it's the Northeast or if it's
I haven't heard about it.
Apparently there was an article or a story about it on CNN.
Yep,
add one more thing to the supply chain issue.
Yeah. CO2. We have excess CO2 in the air, but we can't get it for our tanks.
Can't get it out of there.
Yeah, we can't. Now they won't be buying CO2 absorbers from the air, and we'll be saving the planet by taking care of our tanks.
Yeah. All right, guys.
There you go, Sanjay. There's a project to work on. You got to develop CO2 removal for supplying our reef tanks.
Yeah, harness the CO2 in the air.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that what your corals are doing?
Pretty much.
Yeah. All right.
Harvesting a lot of CO2.
I don't want to keep you guys too much longer, but just a couple of broad questions for you in terms of, we've been talking a lot about trends and how things have changed over the years. Do you guys see any future trends out there that are positive, favorable things for the industry and the hobby?
I see the positivity mainly coming from people like Jamie Craig's doing spawning and providing the information so that we can start spawning stuff in our tanks. Rather than fragging things, having 10,000 planula and baby corals would be pretty cool. And also the work he's doing with hybridizing stuff to get, because what's funny is, I'll never forget this. I was sitting and drinking with Alf Nilsson and Charlie Verone at a MACNA probably 20, 25 years ago. And we were having a pretty good time. And Charlie Verone looked at me and he goes, "I don't understand you Americans. You're so obsessed with what this type of coral is." He said, "There's probably realistically only 6 different kinds of acropora." He said, "But they hybridize, they change because of light, they change because of flow. You guys all think these are different. They may just be hybrids." I said, if he would see what we do now with named corals and how everything is, he's probably crying, going, "You people are insane." So I see the positivity of what Jamie's doing and hybridizing things and eventually saying, you know what, this coral that we thought was this is actually a hybrid of this and this. I think that's going to prove that Charlie Verone was right 25 years ago.
I think this whole spawning thing is exciting, and being able to spawn them in aquariums is exciting. Not everybody's going to do it, you know, but there'll be some that'll do it to a level where it'll be very interesting. People are doing it with the fish, you know, people are spawning more and more fish now. So those are some healthy trends, right? I mean, we no longer need to go get captive clownfish anymore, right? There's enough.
No. And I think with fish, once the price gets close between bred and wild will become obsolete. But until then, you know, the difference in price is so prohibitive in a lot of instances, it keeps people from buying them, even though we probably should, because eventually they're going to want to shut it down. But figuring out how to spawn all the different things and figuring out how to market and get people to want more than tank raised clownfish. Because I mean, that's where the future is breeding out, you know, 1,000 yellow tangs for the market rather than, you know, doing 20. So it's going to become an expansion of number rather than variety to provide enough for everybody. Because the thing that has amazed me the most is I've watched this hobby expand over the past 40 years is how many people are in it now compared with how many were there when we started. I mean, when I talk to people, and Sanjay talks to people all over the world, when we started this, there were like 2 guys in every country doing this. Now there's, you know, 500,000 everywhere. It's kind of mind-boggling. And if you post something, the number of people that respond and ask you questions and stuff, I mean, there weren't that many people in the hobby. Now we get questions from those people. So it's good that there's so many people involved. It's exciting that there's so many people involved. But in terms of bad, the thing I'm most concerned about is the finances of being in this hobby, and with the potential recession coming, what that's going to do to the hobby, because the hobby has had basically free reign for the past 10 years when people had a lot of money. And if that money suddenly dries up and they have to decide between buying gas and food or corals, 9 times out of 10, they're probably, well, maybe not. I know I would probably still buy corals.
But the hobby is 9 times out of 10, the coral would win.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm thinking of myself. Yeah, okay, I don't really need bread or milk today.
The corals.
But realistically, there will be a lot more divorces if that's the case. So we can't. My wife's coughing over there, going. So that is my concern for the future. Is the cost of things needs to come down, not substantially, but enough so that it stays relatively flat if things get bad. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, the COVID thing has really changed a lot of things, right? Shipping corals became a lot more, or fish became a lot more expensive, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, freight prices
Quadrupled.
just went sky high, right? People tell me that a container used to cost $4,000 to ship. Now it's costing $20,000 to ship, right? So when you're dealing with that level of magnitude, the prices of these things have gone up quite a bit, right? I mean, I have access and I look at some of the wholesale pricing on some of these things and I go, geez, these wholesale pricing these days is way more than what I used to pay retail.
Yeah, for a lot of things.
Right? For a lot of things. So the equation has changed. And, you know, with prices, you know, they might come down, but they never come down to what they used to be.
Yeah, the shipping thing is concerning to me because just the gas prices and the problem in terms of just staffing and what have you. It's been tough, man. I mean, in terms of just what the cost of freight these days is like mind-boggling compared to what it was, you know, just a couple of years ago before COVID hit. So that is concerning. You know, I think a lot of people also kind of overlook the fact that there are a lot of very affordable things in the hobby that you can you know, pick up in terms of corals, and maybe not so much so much in fish, but at least in corals, you could really find some gems out there for.
If people are, you know, not hung up about these named corals that really don't look that nice to begin with, they've been hyped up. If they, you know, there's lots of good, reasonable corals that you can get.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I've
But
seen
people seem
pictures
to
of.
concentrate around these big names and so on and so forth. And, I don't think the new hobby should get concerned with any of that stuff.
Trading,
No, you can still
swapping.
have a
Right?
nice. You can still have a nice
Learn
soft
to keep the
tank,
corals alive first.
or I mean, grow a big colony of something and look at it from across the room versus looking at a frag of something that costs 10 times as much. I'll take the big coral I can see from across the room. Look at a big colony of red planet, what that looks like in your tank, versus a frag of rainbow whatever. I'll take the big giant colony of red planet anytime.
Yeah, no, it's a gorgeous coral, and I always feel like the corals that catch your eye across the room in terms of the color. I mean, a Milka Stylo, a red planet, an Oregon blue tort, if you don't run blue lights, are stunning, and they're not going to cost you an arm and a leg.
Yeah, but that's my fear, that a lot of these corals that are, were staple in the hobby that nobody cares about now will actually disappear from the hobby.
And they actually have disappeared. I've been trying to find a lot of the older
Because
corals.
you can't find these old corals because they are cheap. Nobody wants them. Nobody then wants to propagate them because it's not worth propagating. And then they disappear from the hobby.
All right, my last question to you guys, both you guys. Mike, you just mentioned this. What corals are you looking for? What's on your list there?
My list, I'm looking for a nice Palmer's blue millipora.
I'm growing one of those out.
Okay, I'm looking for a purple millipora. Those used to be spectacular too. What else am I looking for? Not really much else. I have pretty much everything else I want. I mean, it's sad to say that, but between my tank and the frag tanks and my friends' tanks, there's not. I mean, I'm looking for blue corals. I'm still looking for an old blue hoaxami. I'm looking for a blue albrahensis. I'm looking for a blue geminifera. That's the one coral that, when Fiji used to bring in corals, the geminiferas were the most spectacular corals, and they were very difficult to keep. I've not seen a geminifera probably in 10 years at least. I mean, those are the things I want, the stuff that nobody grows anymore. Because those, to me, when I sit in my chair downstairs and I can see them from 5 feet away, and they're still blindingly colorful. Because I'll be honest, I mean, I have a lot of the name tenuis and other odd millies, and they're really nice if I'm sitting right here and looking at it. But when I'm sitting in my chair and looking into a tank that's 4 feet deep, I don't see them in the back of the tank. I don't see these colors, unless I'm above the tank with a box, which isn't how I like to look at my tank. I like to sit in a chair, relax, see the fish and see the corals. I mean, I like to be like Andrew's tank on a smaller scale. I mean, you just sit back and you can enjoy the symphony that's going on in front of you.
You don't like wearing the orange glasses?
I have probably 30 pair of them. I can't tell you the last time I put one on.
Sanjay, anything you're looking for at this point? Do you have any room?
At this point, all I'm looking for are corals that will not get diseased in my tank. So right now, I'm just waiting to see what happens before I put anything else in.
Fair enough.
I'm just letting it go. We'll wait and see. I'm in a rush.
Sounds like a good plan. All right, guys. Any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
Well, hopefully we'll see everyone that's watching this at MACNA. I mean, come up and say hello. I always like chatting with everybody that's out there and making new friends. So Sanjay and I'll be hanging out a lot together there. So if you can figure out which one of us is which, we'll be grateful for that.
I'm slightly different from Mike. I'm like, just don't come and say hello unless you walk up with a glass of beer.
I definitely.
Yeah, this will be a real fun MACNA. We'll be asleep by noon.
I definitely owe you guys a few drinks.
We'll take you up on that.
Yeah, no, for sure. All right, well, listen, guys, thank you so much for joining me together. This was an awesome chat, and hopefully everybody found it very insightful and useful. Thank you both again. And I also want to thank the sponsors, both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine, for sponsoring the live stream, and all you folks out there tuning in. And also want to thank Paul, the moderator. The other thing I want to mention is that all episodes of Rappin With ReefBum are available as podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Amazon. My next Rappin With ReefBum live stream will be on Thursday, August 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with hobbyist Peter Din, also known as Bay Area Reef. He is a whiz with video and Instagram. So we're going to kind of be digging into some photography and videography tips with Peter. Sanjay, we should have talked about that with you. You're pretty good with the old camera lens yourself.
Yes, and funny doing water drops. Those are pretty crazy.
I also want to mention I'm going to have a live coral sale on Saturday, September 3rd at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time right here on YouTube. You can learn more about that on reefbum.com. If you want to check out the full upcoming schedule of guests for Rappin' with ReefBum, you can check out reefbum.com as well under the YouTube section. So until next time, be safe, be well, and we will see you next time. Adios.